Alright, Invasions, Volume 1. Somehow, I'm not sure if Volume 2 will come out, and I'm not sure how much I trust it, for a number of reasons. Okay. So, let me check my video there. I moved it way up. How about that? Let's get a little down there. If you've watched any of my playthrough or even the intro, you'll be pretty sure that I struggled with this one. And there are a number of reasons. One, let's put this back, cover it up later. The rulebook is a fucking mess as delivered. It's not playable the way it was originally delivered. On top of that, one of the elements that was supposed to be provided, which was the scenario book for everything except the campaign scenario, which I probably don't care about, but it would be interesting to look at, was not shipped at all. It was only available in PDF form for some kind of excuse about it not being shipped from China where the game was produced. And things were weird. This was produced when all hell was breaking loose and it got delayed by that. But, and maybe something got lost, or maybe there wasn't enough money to pay for it, because you would think you'd get money back of some sort for it not being shipped. And they had difficulty paying the shipping costs from this Kickstarter project. This is one of two very bad Kickstarters I've been involved in. An online living rules has been created with huge amounts of changes. The game deserves a rewrite. It didn't really get that, but I am told that is a playable game. I tried using it because search capability in it, whatever, to answer questions that I had. Sometimes I could find the answers, sometimes I couldn't. What I can't do is I can't sit at the computer screen and read it. And what I don't want to do is spend $20 trying to print out a version of the rules that is supposedly playable. Especially because some of the changes made appear to be quick fix patches to try to cover up for a game that was never properly developed. Okay. Let's talk about it. Starter. The components that you get. Well, first of all, in the Kickstarter, it was possible to order a couple of bonus things. And of course, I'm like, hey, it's a Thibault game, take my money. I know I'll love it eventually. Even though I'm not sure I'm on board with the idea behind it. I don't think I ordered all of them, and one of them may have been the missing scenario book. I'm not sure. That may have been a Kickstarter element that I just didn't order, so in a way I kind of get it for free with PDF. Again, it wasn't something I was really looking for. What I was really interested in were the two that expanded the gameplay. One to a previous part of the a previous era to the game, and the other out to the east. Unfortunately, they don't combine together, supposedly, although honestly, I'm not sure that would matter, because I don't really trust the balance of the game at all, for various reasons. The board is really beautiful. This is a quarter of it. It folds out to something huge, and even though it's huge and really lovely, the spaces on the board are too small, especially given the larger and sometimes unreadable counters, some of the graphic choices of how to put the name of the particular nation they belong to is very, very difficult to read. In some cases, it's very easy, like this white on green for the Swabi here. And you'll see I have counters mixed in bags. It's not completely random. It's kind of by what period they come in during, because I think that would be most useful. So some of the counters are not visible in and of themselves. They end up cluttering up this tiny spaces in the map, and you're not able to see important information that's required for the map. There's also some graphic elements on the map itself that the boundaries between areas that just is not sufficiently distinguished. Problematic, I would say. You have a bunch of pretty decent cards. There's some color issues. So there's event cards that are dark and event cards that are light. And this is kind of a weird decision because it kind of telegraphs, hey, is that a hold or a play immediately event? Okay. That's a design decision, I understand. But then there's some other cards that have like this dark coloration on them for no reason that just appears to be a mistake in printing. Got a bunch of these battle dice. I find them kind of a cute idea. They allow you to have more of a Britannia style. So this game has two real influences on it. One is the Britannia systems, a whole bunch of games in that, which I'm kind of lukewarm on, and we'll go into that a little bit. And these dice kind of provide that aspect a little bit more. The other is, I'm trying to remember, Kingdom, Barbarian, and Empire, or something like that, which has been on my watch list. It doesn't tend to go very cheaply. In a lot of ways, this probably is more of a replacement for that. But they both kind of, this does show the movements of peoples in the way of a Britannia game. And I tend to look at it more from the Britannia side, because a lot of the game is like that. Anyway, these dice are for a Britannia-style combat system, but one that's tailor-made with special dice and everything, not just roll 5s and 6s. And has replacement dice that you can swap in that are better, and some other effects. It also has the option, and I don't remember if it uses the 10-siders or 6-siders, for a supposedly advanced combat system, which really is just one that doesn't use buckets of dice. And it looks like an attempt to mimic this combat system rather than something that's actually trying to get more realism or anything like that. My guess is some people don't like buckets of dice. There was something similar in Europa Universalis, which this designer also wrote, and I kind of stayed away from it as well. I liked the more detailed combat system rather than, I think they called it the fast combat system. And you have a bunch of these cards, one per nation basically, and a couple of extras, that work like the Britannia nation cards, where they tell you what's coming in. Interesting, I didn't really pay attention to that. I wonder if it aligns with what's in the little play aid for the thing. And they give you the victory points that any given nation has in a turn. Now, all of this has errata. Okay. There is nothing, I think, that came unscathed. Basically, you have to mark up components of your game if you want a workable game. And that's a problem in and of itself. This bag is not included in the game, but is kind of necessary for selecting random units, random reinforcements for certain nations. You have a set of player aids, one which is just your random events book, and it's not too detailed, It's not like an EU-style random events. Most of the random events are covered on these cards. You have two other decks of cards that I find a lot more problematic because they're kind of hold cards. One of them is, well, no, they're not. They require a lot of reshuffling of small decks of cards. That's my big objection. One of them is your diplomacy cards, which you hold for a turn and can use, and I found didn't really influence the game much. Early on in the game, they were more usable, but as countries began to age, they didn't have the money to do any diplomacy. And most of the diplomacy was not really terribly effective. You know, it was things like give somebody a bunch of money, and then if they don't attack you, they can have a couple victory points. Yeah. That was one of them. One of them is give somebody some money and you get to use one of their units for your turn, I guess. The events, yeah, you have to hold on to them and try to figure out if you're going to use them. And you're playing a lot of countries, even if you're playing this in an opposed game, you're playing a lot of countries at once. And you have to kind of, constantly be looking and thinking whether you want them. In addition to the event cards, there's these chits, which are pillage chits, some of which have events listed on them, and they don't give you any information. So the only place you can find out anything about them is in here. For the most part, what's on the cards matches what's here. There's not there's not a lot of use for this other than for these chits. Although there are certain things that show up on other cards. The calamities show up on the third type of card, which is an administrative card. The administrative cards throw some randomness into the economic health of your empire, and also its military health. And they can throw calamities your ways, basically another set of events that are not things that you hold at all. But some of them have ongoing effects, and there's no real way to mark them. There's not a lot of information on the counters, so it's not like when you're looking at the counters, you're usually trying to find, it's not like there's small numbers or anything that you have to read. The only really hard part is whose piece is this sometimes. And that can be kind of tricky, especially since a couple of the counters are misprinted, so that when you flip them over, they have another country on them, which is a little bit of a pain. Some of the other player aids, basically each player in the game has one of these booklets, which gives them the special rules that affect nations under their control, but generally one nation under their control. So like this is the Huns. This is the green player's booklet. This side pretty much is all Hunnic rules. Maybe not entirely, I think so. And then they have copies of the victory points that are on their card here. And again, it might be different. And then some information here that's not duplicated on everyone. So in their case, they have some of the tables that are available. The Goths, this is the blue players. They have the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, but they also have some other rules on here, including the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic invasions of Britain, which they are part of, the Slavic tribes, which has nothing to do with them at all, except the Goths are probably the first people to touch them. And then they have the setup for the main scenario, instead of the tables that maybe everybody needs. You have the Persian player, who largely, again, has rules that involve Persia, although not only Persia. Then this end of the game rules here. And then some references to go look in somebody else's player aid for other stuff, while there's probably enough room to put the information there. More of those tables. These are different tables that everybody kind of needs access to. You might be better, I don't know. I'm thinking you might be better off cutting these, but who knows. Then the red player has two booklets because they're running the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is in two parts, and there's a lot of rules on the Romans. So they have actually 2 pages of rules for each of the Roman breakups. And most of what's in here has something to do with these particular Romans or with the conjunction of them. And we have the timetable on the Byzantines, which is a copy of something that, again, is in the rule book, but everybody might need to reference. And then for the Romans, they have nothing special on the back at all. They have this. which I don't know if anybody else has. I don't know if anybody else has this. This is some of the nations that they control. This is a sheet of paper I wrote up because there's almost no way to keep track of who controls an area in the game. Perhaps control markers would help there. I'm even growing a little iffy about that, even though I insist on that. I actually am beginning to think that that you're going to need a lot of self-generated, handwritten stuff in this game, one way or another. This is one thing that actually really helped me a lot towards understanding the control, and I'm not sure that control markers would do as good a job because the information that's kept on here, some of it is variable, like the number of cities in a particular area, where that's important to some people's understanding of control. The control rules to this are really a pain in the ass. Yeah, this big book of appendices, which is essentially all the information in those little play areas. Did it need to be repeated? I don't know. Again, it's nice to have other copies of it. This could be passed around so other people can look at your victory conditions, which is important in a Britannia-style game to know what other people are looking at. You have this, which is basically your victory point record. You can keep track of your victory points on a per nation basis and on a per turn basis. You can keep a running total, whatever you want to do. It's helpful for analyzing the game more than anything else. You do need to have paper and pencil to write down your scores, and I find it helpful to start to understand the game by putting down some values there. The rulebook. Well, first of all, one of my little bugaboos. The rulebook's in a glossy print. You're gonna write something on glossy paper. Make damn sure you get it almost entirely perfect, because there's no opportunity to write well in glossy paper. And I tried with a couple of things. Sometimes I find that glossy paper will take pencil. That was a new finding. This stuff doesn't. I tried a couple different pencils. It just doesn't take it at all. Which is what my normal gripe is I can't write anything in pencil. So now my choices are, if there are any changes, if I want to use the as written, and provided to me that I paid for rulebook, I can't. Now, the changes in this are probably too extensive to have written down everything. Some of the places, there's just no place that you could put the amount of new information that was added to the game or replaced in the game or whatever. There was a complete failure in development on this project. I don't know if that's because it's a Kickstarter and hey, we got to get it out quickly, which seems to be an attitude with Kickstarters, whereas established companies don't do that, one hopes. Usually what they do is they say, all right, I know we had this, we had promised you we're going to try to get this to the publisher this year. It needs more work. So sorry. And you haven't put your money down, so you don't really have a complaint, right? And so there's less of a rush for a company to get a product out just because, yeah, we were hoping to, but it's just not being developed properly. It's not working. This one should not have come out anywhere near this year. It feels like the game was not fully defined to begin with. Was somehow, I assume, play tested. God knows. So the playtesting credits are Philip Thibault and many, many fellow players and friends. Which to me kind of sounds like maybe he broke it out and played it with people, rather than any kind of formalized playtesting groups, rather than any kind of formalized blind testing, which this absolutely, a blind tester would have looked at this, started reading the rules, and said, this game doesn't work. I mean, this rule set would have never gone to that final, we made it through blind testing, we're good. It just couldn't have. But it couldn't have even made it through good play testing with the designer present. I've seen that done. First of all, the designer hands you the rules in the best case scenario and says, read them overnight, and then, okay, I've seen it done once. But I was really impressed with it. It was basically an attempt to simulate blind testing, and it was read the rules. I want to see if they make sense. I want you guys to play the game in front of me, and I'll take notes where things don't work. I've seen games play tested with the designer present where the designer is like, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. And they write down a note that it's not in the rule book. I've also seen people who do a very, very early level of kind of, hey, is the game working at all? Is there a game here? Is there something I can sell? Which should have been done before any Kickstarter was started, right? Which is along the lines of, okay, I'll just make up the rule now, and to make sure that people get through the game and we can see what we're developing and whether it's something that, whether it's something that deserves the additional development and an attempt to sell it to people ahead of time with Kickstarter or whatever. I would say that this rule book probably, as written, and maybe even the current version, although some people say they love the game as it's been modified, I'm not sure why, my feeling is even with the current living rules of it, it probably isn't developed enough to have started saying, let's start collecting your money for it. That's just my feeling. Honestly, my feeling is when something goes to Kickstarter, it has been designed and developed. And you pretty much should be looking at, okay, what components are we delivering to you and how do we get it set up? Rather than, I got this neat idea, let me see if I can make those rules work somehow. Definitely should not have been on glossy paper. Never put anything on glossy paper. It foils any kind of changelog type changes to the game. And people are buying a board game with included rules, expecting those rules will be usable. So if there's a few little changes, you have to be able to mark those changes up. You shouldn't have to use a magic marker to do that, which is what you have to do here. You have to use a Sharpie or something to get it to work on this. Right. So let's start taking a look at the different things in the game and how I think about them. But one of the first things that I want to talk about is this concept of a Britannia-style game. My first reaction was, this sounds like a Britannia-style game. Wow, I'm not sure I want to deal with that. Well, Philip Thibault wrote two of my favorite games out of two games that he wrote. Yes, they both have huge problems with them. There's no question about that. They did not get developed enough. I was expecting that this would not be adequately developed. I wasn't expecting it would be glossy, but maybe I didn't read well enough. I wasn't expecting that the graphics and the rulebook would be the same style as AWE, but I'm not shocked. The problem with a Britannia-style game is its simplicity, right? That's also its beauty. But for me, I'm not sure I want to pay $100 and something for a Britannia-style, moving my people around and all that. But this doesn't quite do that. This worries more about the military details hanging on that Britannia framework. A previous game by Azure Wish, not by Philip Thibault, Hispania, did something a little similar. It took those military details and kind of fleshed them out and made them richer. And they're basically special capabilities, right? So you have cav units, and then they have their special charges and stuff like that. You have whatever you have, it's all done by kind of special rule additions to that Britannia model. The Britannia model dealt with you own territory by having a piece in it. And that piece was really your population. And your military capability was kind of reflected by how dense your population is. Well, I think Hispania introduced the idea of intercepting with stacks of units, and stuff like that, that felt more military in concept. They had their knight units, which were kind of like Romans, but were a little bit more potent in some ways. They had a number of different types of pieces in the game that could do different things. And they added a lot of chrome to it. And honestly, you start adding a lot of chrome to the Britannia system, and it just starts getting weighed down again and again. For Hispania, that ended up in a failure, in my opinion. I know it goes for a lot of money, or at least it did at one point. But it's a completely unbalanced game. One of the beauties of the Britannia system is you have this kind of competitive multiplayer situation where people are fighting over the points that they can collect. It's a fairly simple concept. It's easy to express the rules. They usually only take a few pages. The combat system is very simple. And it's kind of a dice chucking event, you know? The only thing that's kind of painful in the game is looking up, where do I get my victory points? Well, Hispania kept that side of things and added a bunch of weight to it in terms of special capabilities, etc. This game threw everything but the kitchen sink at that idea. But it also walked away from you control a territory by sitting in it. Okay, now it's kind of taken you control a territory by sitting in it, or if you're a civilized nation, or a barbarian for that matter, by controlling the area that it exists in. And for civilized nations, you just keep control of something, even if you completely abandon it with your military, as long as you control that area. And that's why I need that little sheet of paper, because you have to write down who controls areas, because it's not obvious from the map who controls what. It's still difficult to assess because area control switches at just about any time. It's not like at the end of your turn if you control these. It changes all the time. So an interception can make you lose an area because you accidentally moved pieces out of a province that you needed to hold, if you were going to lose the next province, right? Or one of the other provinces. So some weird shit can happen there. Why doesn't this work? Because it's not really focusing on the migration of the pieces. And here's another thing. The Britannia system, you're focusing on this migration of populations, much like you do in Civilization. Britannia, or in History of the World, in a way. Although History of the World is a lot weirder. But I consider it in a similar vein. Okay. So if you're not focusing on the migration of populations in this game, but you're only focusing on the military occupation of areas, and that's sufficient for you to be a thriving country and whatever, that you just control the territory that you're sitting on, well, what does that take you to? The military details of the game are more than they are in your sort of vanilla Britannia game. But they're a whole lot less than is provided in, say, Imperium Romanum, which, to be fair, isn't dealing on the same time scale, is a military simulation. They're less certainly than in something like Europa Universalis. Again, different time scale, better suited to the military. This is part of the problem. Here you have 25-year turns, I think it is. I don't know, I'd have to look at the turn book. And maybe they're not all the same. But in which the military operations are trying to be simulated. They almost look like 1 year's campaigning for all your pieces. But then, if you have exemplary leaders, you get additional campaigns with those leaders, which is meant to represent, I think, fighting that's going on outside, outside what feels like a 1 year's campaign, honestly, or a couple of years campaign. And so you kind of zoom in somehow looking at how those leaders are operating, and they're able to conquer stuff. But there's no interleaving of the time between them, for the most part. There's one turn where there is, just to throw a special rule into everything. But for the most part, what happens is you're following that Britannia-type model. I move all my pieces, I fight my battles. Then maybe I get some additional moves, a la a major invasion for Britannia. That works in Britannia, because it's such a light game. Here, though, with that extra focus on the military, it feels wrong. But it gets worse than that. And here I'm looking at, the core concept of the game I see as problematic. What is the game trying to represent? It's trying to represent these overall emotions of the people. Now, a Britannia-style game would do that just fine, without giving you any insight. Hey, the Danes want to be in York. Why? I don't know. Because they were historically. Okay, well, whatever. That's a game. It's not really a simulation of anything. It's just like this game driving you to go where you want to go. This uses that same victory point model, when the reality of the matter is that these barbarian hordes were moving to areas for very specific reasons that the game does not model and does not try to show. And you could say, well, let it be. It's a Britannia-style game. I know, but you're hanging so much on it that I would like something with this much detail and this much attempt to provide information, especially the economic details that it has, the military details it has. I'd want it to give me something about the why these forces, why these big barbarian tribes are moving where they are, and to represent that in some way. It doesn't. Oh, hey, you're the Vandals? You want to be in Africa. Does it matter if someone else got there first for some reason? Not that anybody else wants to be there. No, you just want to be in Africa. There's a bunch of people, you want to be in Spain. Why do you want to be in Spain? I don't know. There's plenty of good territory where I am. Why would I want to be in Spain? I don't know. That's where my victory points is. And I can level that as a criticism against Britannia as a whole. But the price that you pay to get no insight from Britannia and just some fun die chucking is very low. The price that you pay, and I'm not talking just money here at all, I'm talking about the price in terms of investment in the game, that you get to find out no more about why the peoples are moving where they are in this game, seems ridiculous, right? You're not getting a detailed military treatment. If you want that, you go to Imperium Romanum. Maybe. I got my gripes about that game too, but are you getting a detailed economic treatment? You're getting a very random and interesting economic treatment that I think is better handled by a game like Empires of the Middle Ages, which, is very abstract, gives you a lot of randomness, and gives you the same kind of general decline. And the heart of these things is what makes the game kind of there's some neat components here, and I think I could make a game maybe that would be interesting, but this wasn't that game. This isn't the game that I want. And is that a fair criticism? I don't know. You know, I mean, it's one that I didn't know I had before I picked it up, right? It wasn't until I started playing this that I started to see what this game could have been. That it could have been something that dealt with the economics of the empire, especially the empire in the West, and the fact that the population was declining, as the motivation for why the barbarians were moving into those territories, and why they were not moving into the Near East, why they were not moving into Egypt. Those areas were operating perfectly fine. There was no opportunity, no need for more people to move into those areas. Okay. So, what about the mechanisms of the game itself? Well, I'm going to take a look at the brief turn sequence and try to look at those and discuss them. But first, I need to swap batteries because I bet you're almost ready to wear out on me. Okay, let's keep going a little bit further. I may not be able to finish this in time before my dinner is ready. Okay, the first thing that happens in the game, and this is really important to driving the concept of the game, is the status of nations. Basically, each nation in the game, and there are a ton of them, don't start out very many. It starts out a controllable amount, but it can get quite large, especially if you play it by the rules as they were originally written, as opposed to the living rules. Each nation ages, and that basically just means it moves up a space on the track, but when it reaches a certain age, as a barbarian state, it has almost a requirement to, battery's not charging, right, to turn into a kingdom, wherever it's sitting. That's where it's going to settle down, and it's going to become a civilized state. Okay, that's interesting. Wherever you settle down doesn't determine what your victory points are going to be late in the game. So if you don't make it where you're expected to go, even though you don't get the victory points early on, and maybe that makes some sense, hey, we really want it to be in Spain, you also will never get any victory points for that country. So if somehow you fuck up with your country, it can become a surviving and thriving thing in the wrong place and get you almost nothing, or possibly nothing at all. That's a little disturbing, and that lends towards my statement of where these countries want to go and where they end up settling down should be driven by the game, the board state, what's going on in the world, in order to explain it. There's no reason for the Vandals to want to be in Africa rather than to stop in Spain, except they're being pressed from behind. And if they end up moving in later, they shouldn't be trying to force their way through somewhere else. You know, there's just no reason for it. The aging of kingdoms is a little different. If a kingdom reaches a certain, if it reaches a certain size, it can become an empire, which resets its age clock. So from a barbarian to a kingdom resets the age clock from a king, and there's no pain. I mean, a barbarian can remain a barbarian for as long as it possibly can without any penalty. A kingdom, though, has a real strict clock. First of all, there's 12 turns on that clock, and once you reach the end of that 12 turns, you're going to start paying essentially victory point penalties for each turn you go further. Secondly, a kingdom gets additional aging, not just the one per turn, through their administrative cycle and through bankruptcy. These are things the barbarians don't have to worry about. They just age, and that determines when they have to eventually fall into being a kingdom. Now, it's not immediately clear that you don't want to be a kingdom. Like, you get extra victory points for becoming a kingdom. You get extra economic capabilities and better military units. So there's a lot of reasons that you think you might want to become a kingdom. They're probably false. You probably want to avoid being a kingdom for as long as you possibly can hold out, and still collect your victory points as a barbarian. And then when you fall into being a kingdom, you accept your fate there and try to delay your victory point penalties for as long as you can through your economic choices and through the possibility of becoming an empire. Becoming an empire is hard. It requires basically controlling 3 civilized areas. That's really tough to do. I'm not sure anyone in the period turned into an empire in this game. And then once you're an empire, you also age. And your penalty for aging as an empire is a little different. You don't take victory point penalties for aging as an empire for the most part, but you do get to a point where economically you're no longer feasible and you're likely to suffer bankruptcies, and they could just dissolve you as an empire, and then you're just gone. With the rules as written, the only way countries are removed from the game is they become empires and they go bankrupt and destroy themselves. In the case of the 2 Romes, they break into post-Roman nations, which are basically penalties on the players who own them. For other empires that may or may not exist, they just vaporize. Okay, what about the kingdom penalty? Well, again, as the game was originally written, those kingdoms just keep aging and they stay in the game, and they generate a victory point penalty. That victory point penalty actually appears to be important to the balancing of the game. I'm not positive of this. I don't have much faith that it's balanced no matter what. Having seen EU and having seen the development effort that apparently went into this game, it's quite possible that it's completely, broken anyway there in terms of how many victory points you can expect to get. This is one of the fundamental problems with doing this kind of, a game of this nature with so much randomness, etc. in it. It actually has very large random events that can swing, probably 100 points out of, in the game that I played, the leading player had like 700 points. The next player had 550. Clearly that's an amount that could significantly impact the game. Maybe more than 100 points, I don't know. But very simple random occurrences could basically make it so you can't win the game. This is not like I'm getting a whole bunch of bad die rolls, or my enemies have set themselves up so that I'm not going to generate the points that I want. That are both possibilities in the Britannia genre in general. Rather, this is something where just, oh look, some really terrible luck hit me. I'm not going to win. I'm not going to win this, I don't know how long. It's at least a 25, 30-hour game. Possibly, probably more. So, that's changed. In the living rules, they have specifically put something in where a player can abandon their nation. And maybe there's a way that nation, it appears like there's a way that if somebody conquers that nation, they can turn it into something called an inactive kingdom. There are a small number of inactive kingdoms in the game. One reason that I would say, there are a number of reasons for this, that I don't think this was the basic intent of the game. I don't think this was the intention, but I think people were like, this fucking sucks sitting around on something that's just draining victory points every turn. Well, if you knew that ahead of time, it wouldn't be so bad because you'd kind of planned for it. But put that aside. There are counters for the 4 inactive kingdoms. I didn't even notice these until I was cleaning up the game, and I'm like, oh, what are those for? Oh! No explanation of them or anything. But they're basically counters that they're client states. So I don't know who owns it, what the right term is for somebody who owns client states, but basically the superior country in the relationship gets money from them every turn, and these are counters that superior country holds. Well, there aren't any for all the other countries. You could give them like a raid counter or something. There's a way you could do it, but it is a little weird that the idea of adding new inactive kingdoms is just put into the game. On the other hand, there are other new inactive kingdoms that may not have counters. I think they do, though. Okay, so let's. So that's a reason not to believe that like these patches to the rules were what the game was intended to be all along. They feel in a lot of ways to be a lot more like, wow, people hate this game, and I see why. Okay, let's stick some tape on it and see what happens, right? Okay. Another problem with it is, and this is a fundamental flaw, I think. Aging is almost always in one direction. On the other hand, you have things that were incredibly vibrant in this period. The Franks come to mind in particular as a kingdom that's formed during this period and really does not age into something that falls apart. Okay? You could make an argument that the Franks become an empire, although within the game terms, that would be hard to express. It would be hard to make that argument under Charlemagne, but not before that. And here we're talking about probably after whatever the second volume is. Well, maybe not. The second one goes to 925, so yeah, you'd probably get your empire there. But it would be late in that game. There is no way that the Franks can establish themselves as a kingdom in the time that they did, at the time of Merovingus, which is when they kind of historically did. They made it all the way to the 12 end of the chart and were starting to lose victory points, even though they had territories. They were not going to be a viable nation for much longer. That loss of victory points comes with economic loss. It becomes harder to keep yourself in the territory that you control. External pressures are happening. There's just no way. And so there's something fundamentally broken in the way the aging is represented. And there should be something that allows you to keep your kingdom viable without moving to the empire model, which also has a limited time period. Now, the Carolingian Empire broke into three eventually, and two of those three states survived. There's got to be this kind of rebirth mechanism in play, and it ought to be something that you can work towards. There are some cards that allow you to take a couple of points off your age. That's not enough. It's got to be something similar to becoming an empire, but that doesn't require that many areas, because quite simply, the Anglo-Saxons also revitalized. They did not just become a target for the Scots to completely destroy, as an example, which could have happened in this very shortly in the time span that I'm looking at. So the aging mechanism doesn't work fundamentally, in my view. And we'd have to see. Maybe the second volume does something that magically makes things able to unage dramatically, similar to becoming an empire. I don't know. But clearly, nations were formed that did not turn into rotting hulks. Some did, some didn't. And there's got to be some mechanism in the game. The aging may just be too fast. It's a guaranteed one per turn, and a likely another one on average per turn from the administrative events, assuming you have the money to pay for the decent administrative events. Okay. Beyond that, then heresies age. We had very few heresies show up on the game. This is a period where heresies were spawning all over the place. This was definitely a problematic period for Christianity. It doesn't seem represented enough in the game. It's largely represented. It largely comes about through events and calamities, and they just don't show up enough. Especially given some of the rules regarding heresies, like them helping trigger the Arab invasion at the end of the game, being a very key thing. And that's a huge event. Now, it's a huge event that probably has a lot less impact on the rewritten rules, because there aren't players like the red player who collect all their victory points early in the game and need those negative victory points from their dying kingdoms to balance things out. But we'll leave that aside for a moment. Okay. The next, let me take a peek at what we have left. Okay. The next thing on the chart is the reinforcements. That basically gives you certain named leaders, which are prefixed, like in Europa Universalis. To me, that's kind of I don't really like that, but it's a design decision I've accepted in EU. I'm not going to complain about it here. And the barbarian nations get fixed amount of forces. And that all works simply and fine. I've got no problem whatsoever with it. Then you have the events, and each player gets one event card, which might be kind of a very random event, a play immediately type thing, or it might be something that helps you. It might not be very playable for the countries you have. You can't trade these, but you can play them for other people, maybe as part of a deal. I'll play an event for you if you play an event for me. Great. You have raiders. There are these little raider countries that are in the game, which feel like a complete waste of time to me. They barely affect the play of the game, and they might kill some pieces, but for the most part, and they generate a few victory points, but for the most part, they're a non-event in the game, and I do not like them. And then you have a randomization for which caravan space on the board, there's 4 of them, is going to produce extra money. Okay. Then you get this diplomacy thing, where all civilized nations may get diplomacy cards. Empires automatically get one, I think. But then beyond that, it's by your leadership. And so most of the kingdoms don't get them, but you got to go through all the kingdoms, see if they have them. And then, like I said, they're kind of a pain in the ass. They're useful to the early Roman and Byzantines, and maybe the early Persians, and maybe when a kingdom or something is really rich and flush with cash, it can afford to pay some of these diplomatic events. But for the most part, I started ignoring them towards the end of the game. They were just too expensive. And the bonus is, at the end of the turn, you get $1 for them. So, since money had become so valuable for almost everyone, including the empires, getting that extra piece of money was worth more than trying to take advantage of the card. Whew. Then you go to the complexity of the administration. Okay, well, barbarians get to pretty much ignore this. But for the other players, it's kind of a cute system. You get a choice of, it's a mechanism that looks neat, but has its issues. But you get a choice of, you get a draw of cards based on the quality of your leadership. You get 2 base cards plus cards for the administrative capabilities of your leader. And they come in 3 different types. Passive, military, and reform. Passive is just, I'm going to get screwed, but I'm not going to pay a lot of money for it. Military is, I'm going to try to preserve my leader's ability to fight. Like, if I have a good military leader, it's a good idea to pay the extra money for that if you can afford it. But it generally will screw you outside of that. And then the third one is the reform, which is very, very expensive, which means it's almost unplayable for most players. But it can prevent your aging or reduce your additional aging or whatever. It slows your aging process. It can even take age away from you. And some of the others maybe can too. Just they're not as likely to. But it's not very likely to either from what I saw. The problem is paying that money can cause you to go into, it can put you in a position where you're likely to go into bankruptcy because money becomes very important later in the game. Early on, the two Romes and Persia have a lot of cash. They can afford a lot. You take some calamities from those cards. Now here's the thing. You get a set of cards, and then you pick one type of card that you have that you want to enact. So, if you have multiple cards of one type, that becomes more attractive because you're more likely to dodge a bullet because there's bad cards in every set. But do you really want to pick like 1 out of 3 passives instead of your reform if you have the money for the reform? That's a hard call, and you don't get to look beforehand. Then you get to look and make your choice of one of the cards out of the set. You calculate out income, which is a pain in the royal ass, because again, how you control territories is different for each type of nation. Each has their own rules. There's some ambiguities in the original rules. I am not convinced that they're entirely ironed out. But whatever in the rewrite, or in the many levels of errata, so it's on 1.1F. Okay, A, B, C, D, E, F. Six rewrites of the rules have gone into play since publication and delivery. Okay, that's just to give you an idea here. They're not complete rewrites, none of them are. But 6 attempts to patch the rules, as in the players wrote in and said, this is unplayable as it is because of this. Some of them may have been fairly small. Some of them are more painful. So calculating out income requires that you understand who controls what areas. And again, that's a burdensome thing. Look at some of my playthroughs, see how it works. Then you're allowed to purchase units. For the most part, nobody has any real restrictions on purchasing units. The barbarians can't do it. The kingdoms and empires can build whatever they want out of their countermix, except for Rome. Rome has limited military rebuild capability. Now, they kind of can make up for this by being able to buy auxiliary units, but their best units, they're not able to rebuy in quantity. They're basically allowed to buy one unit of their own nationality per turn, and later in the game up to 2. To allow the Byzantines to survive a little bit, I guess. And then if you're parked in a revolt, you get to see if you subdue it. I'm going to pause here because I think my dinner's coming soon, and that'll get us to the military side of the game. Okay, we don't have much left here, but I wanted to get my dinner in without trying to rush through this. So the next thing is the military phase, and that's handled with this kind of, again, you're zooming out 25-year turns, you move all your pieces, and it feels almost like a regular military game for that. You might have invasion. It also feels almost like Britannia, but I'll leave those two alone. And then you have these pulsings where individual leaders are able to gather forces together. And this is where the game, being kind of lax in terms of how it's described, actually works really well, because they're able to state something like, you can kind of pause your movement with one unit and move another unit and everything. That kind of looseness isn't usually allowed in games, and there's a good reason not to. Mechanically, it's hard to cope with, for one thing. You might have to put little markers down to indicate, well, I've moved this many movement points. But beyond that, that looseness allows you to kind of reposition. First of all, you can reposition your leader in a stack before a campaign, and then suck in more units and go off and do things. And then as you're doing things, you can leave units behind to siege, pull in more units, all kind of stuff like that. So you've got all this flexibility, and I probably cheated a little bit in terms of overusing that flexibility because it's not well defined. Other things that aren't terribly well defined is the stacking. At least from my reading, and I didn't look too hard because I don't want to look too hard. Damn it. The game has strict stacking, except that like in setup, you're allowed to overstack, and it looks like maybe when you're building units and stuff, you're allowed to overstack to some extent. I'm not absolutely certain, so I kind of was a little laxer in stacking than I should have been, and maybe allowed my leaders to have stronger campaigns because they would suck in a unit while temporarily leaving a unit somewhere else. You know, all kind of weird shit like that, which could be done. For the actual movement, campaign or otherwise, there's interceptions, there's fleeing from combat, there's stuff like that. There's specific sieges where any city you want to take, you have to make a die roll for. And all of this is impacted by along with other parts of the game, by the events. You might have events that help you with one of these things or whatever. You have specific naval rules for transporting units and how much they pay for moving. And this gets mixed in again with that split movement. You could like move a fleet, pick up units on that fleet, deposit them somewhere, and then move the fleet further on. Just a lot of weird shit is going on here that would be hard to express. Like trying to nail that down with a strict set of rules would probably be almost impossible. So the looseness of this, and I'm going to call it AWE style rules or maybe European style rules, allows you to sort of state things, and the players may not be sure that they're playing by the rules, but they kind of get the idea of what they're supposed to do. It might generate arguments, but I would argue that this game is such a mess anyway that it's going to do that no matter what. And then you hit the scoring phase, which is basic. So scoring happens in a couple of different ways. One, it's basically Britannia-style scoring. You get points for doing stuff. I said that somewhere else. During the middle of your turn. So you kill some units, you might get points for killing them if you're in the right place and they're the right type of enemy. Again, the Britannia-style games tend to have this kind of scoring, but it tends to follow a pattern, and maybe there's one or two countries that don't follow the pattern. Here, it's a lot more mixed up because there's so many different countries. Most of them do follow kind of a pattern where if they wanted to kill something, they probably, if they have the opportunity and or want to kill something, chasing their victory points, they probably get points for it, and it's probably 1 point per unit. But there are definite exceptions to that. So you kind of have to always check your card. Feels like it's going to be more of a burden than in the Britannia side. And then you have scoring for the provinces that you actually own. And this is a pain in the ass. Largely because there's a fair number of specifically named things. There's a lot of different countries in the game. Each player has a lot of them. You've got to keep that all balanced. They seem largely to kind of fit your historical expectations. So if you know anything about who settled where, you would have an idea of what they probably want. But then there's some weirdnesses in there. For some of the more established things, like the Byzantines or the Persians, they don't get any points for where they're expected to be. They get points for where they wished they were, or sort of the height of their aspirations, essentially. And late in the game, they could almost essentially move their kingdom Like the Byzantines could move their kingdom to Italy and Hispania, and they would be tickled pink and get huge quantities of victory points there, and give up all of the Near East. That feels improper to me. Likewise, the Persians can give up the territory that they started and move to Egypt and the Mediterranean coast and get more victory points there. And again, yes, these are the things they wanted and that their goals were at least some points. And things get more twisted because, again, it's not based on why they wanted them. When you look at Justinian, why did he want the West? He wanted to reestablish a combined empire again. He wanted to reestablish Rome to its height across the Mediterranean. When that partially succeeded, the Byzantines spent a great deal of effort trying to maintain that. But had they not succeeded, or had they failed in certain areas, they would have probably not continued chasing that dream. What really happened was they were maintaining outposts that would have politically hurt them to give up. And so it feels a little funky and wrong to score the points that way. I feel that's a more minor dispute than against the barbarians, where I think the barbarians really shouldn't care where they end up, just so they all end up somewhere useful. I'm not quite sure how to balance that, though. I had some ideas, but, well, they didn't fit terribly well. And again, yeah, the barbarians really do not succeed here. Now, this is where, these aging kingdoms, in the scoring I've talked about already, how they seem to serve as sort of a balancing counterpoint to how many points you expect to get from red, who really have the preponderance of these negative points that come to them. They get a huge amount of points off Rome and the Byzantines early in the game, and then a lot of negative points off off the aging remnants that break off of that. And if you follow the current version of the rule, they can just abandon those and never pay that penalty. And I suspect that's going to be a problem. Again, though, I'm not absolutely certain that the victory points in this game are in any way balanced, fair. You've got, even if they were, you've got these huge random events like the Huns, which is presumably the green player's supposed to be best form of points, the major country, the one that they're named after. Even if you do everything right, you have like a 50-50 chance of having the Huns beyond turn 5 in the game. They basically make a die roll to see if they exist. With the Byzantines or Romans, the turn on which they collapse, which is so dictated by random events that can happen, and by the administrative cards that they can pull, as well as other people's actions to some extent, can fall much earlier or later than you expect, and therefore, at least in the case of the Byzantines, they can produce they can produce their expected points, but they could also have those all wiped away by an early failure, by some bad luck, and very bad luck, but okay. And the Romans could outlast their targeted time, which allows them to avoid these negative points for longer, but now the negative points go away. So there's no real penalty there. So they just get to sit on their victory points that they produced during that period. So I don't really know, I'm led by my intuition is that the game was designed to have those negative points in there and people hated them. And instead of reworking the victory point system, which would involve tinkering with everything. And that's what the problem with this victory point system is in a lot of ways, is that it's one of the areas where the game is really fixed to specific things. So it's hard to play with anything that kind of affects that. Whereas, the designer or whoever was adding these little band-aids to the game seems to have just thought, okay, well, whatever. You don't like that? Great. We'll take that out of the game and make things different. But if the game is either as horribly unbalanced as I fear, and that wouldn't surprise me given EU, or if it's as random as it obviously is, how much does that really matter? You're not looking at a game that's going to give you that competitive environment that I feel Britannia kind of generally gives you, that the Britannia style games, with the exception of Hispania, which is just broken as well. Is this completely a broken game? I don't know. I kind of said that early on because it's almost unplayable in terms of some of the mechanical issues that are involved in it. But you do get used to them. There are ways of making things that can help you work with them. I found, that little sheet of paper, keeping track of the area control and getting more used to how the area control is handled, started giving me a little bit more comfort with that. So in a lot of ways, my biggest complaint is one of a matter of taste. I don't think that Britannia-style game, as I said at one other point, should be weighted down with anvils. I look at it as a Christmas tree, which is this sort of simple design that meets a certain type of play, and then it's just, there's so many special rules in this game. Most of the countries have, many of the countries have them. Each player has at least a page of special rules that they have to deal with. The Roman player has 4. And then there's other things that kind of fit in there. There's things that don't seem to mean anything, like mountain units. Mountain leaders have an effect on the game. They can't be ambushed. Oh no, mountain units have a tiny effect. They generate more dice on an ambush, as if they were actual archers. So let me refrain from that one. Overall, though, I mean, there's no way I can recommend this to anyone. No way at all. I don't feel like it's giving the kind of beautifully detailed view that either of Thibault's other games did. Either EU, with its very, very impressive view of historical events, pre-programmed to the larger point, and taking systems from other games, to tell you the truth, things like Empires of the Middle Ages, Empires in Arms, for that matter, a conquistador type feeling towards the colonization. That just gave such a wonderful scope of story that as soon as I kind of saw the box, I knew I was going to love it. In fact, I had dreamed about it before it existed, and before I knew it existed, within like a couple of weeks of finding it. But also, as you start looking at it, you say, oh my God, this is just, he's glued together pieces in a way that maybe it won't work, and he's cut some corners that I don't agree with, but I see what he's trying to do in this frame. And I'd say the same thing with Le Grand Guerre. I see what he's trying to do. He's making this design where the focus is on that national will to a degree that it hasn't been on any other World War I game. With this one, I'm having a lot more trouble seeing that focus. Maybe if I saw Barbarian Kingdom and Empire, I would see more of the driving force behind this and maybe have a better understanding and feel for what the designer's trying to express with it. Because certainly, with those other games, I see some design decisions that I take issue with. But in this one, the biggest one really is that initial choice of let's take a Britannia type game and make it really, really complicated and add all this sort of pain level to it for 25-year turns where the military, you're not really detailing the military out very well when you've got 25-year turns, but you're putting a lot of emphasis and effort into trying to look like you are. And the diplomacy side of things doesn't feel like it's really detailing things out. The economics, yeah, a little bit. But the fact that you have basically 3 different area control and economic systems. Okay, the barbarians are simple for the economics, but you have different economic systems for the kingdoms and the empires. Why? What's up with that? What's going on? You know, is this true? Does this make sense? The aging mechanism, not really capturing, not really providing what looks like and points to the sort of historical narrative that you'd expect there. Instead, you've got something where, you know, the Franks are getting old by 350 and, you know, barely able to maintain themselves already, and not you know, dominating their area completely. And they shouldn't, in a way. I mean, those other tribes did still exist. I almost feel like subjugation should work a little differently. Subjugation should be incorporation into your kingdom in a way that it's kind of not in the game. It's not client states, it's these vassal states, but it almost feels like these become part. So, for example, when you conquer the Alemanni, it almost feels like the Alemanni are now a part of the Frankish kingdom. You're scoring points for them, and you're getting some money off them, but what else is going on? And I feel like that's what's trying to be expressed there, and simply eliminating them doesn't seem like the right solution. But then again, leaving them kicking around also doesn't. I find myself, when I look at roles in the living roles, still where they've put in new roles, where they've put in these patches, still finding myself looking at it and seeing ambiguities and problems in the new rules where it's like, wow, that doesn't clear things up terrible. I mean, it may make a decision that I was unwilling to make, like, oh yeah, you can discard kingdoms whenever you like. The hell with the victory point penalty that you were getting for these. That doesn't matter anymore. But now some of the exceptions to that, not exceptions as to you can't discard them, but to what happens to those kingdoms and who controls them and whatnot. None of that's really spelled out very nicely. So, it feels like it's going to be a never-ending patchwork being built out and forward. And for something that fundamentally isn't pleasing to me in theory, it's very hard to accept the kind of compromises that I had to accept with, say, the lousy events in Europa Universalis, or ahistorical results from the Navy, or the army buildups in La Grande Guerre. So the kind of sloppiness and ineffectual, and ahistorical elements that would come out in those games, coming out here hurt me more, in part because I don't even really see what the grand idea is. On the other hand, there are a lot of beautiful components, and there is sort of the framework of something that I could see maybe molding into something that's a lot more impressive. Chances are that I am going to play this again solo. I've looked, I think I was pointed to a play aid. It really is just a more detailed sequence of play, if I see that right. I find the rulebook, using an electronic rulebook, is essentially impossible. It's got its advantages. You want to search for a word or something, you can look for it. it's got its disadvantages. Words aren't consistently used. The things aren't necessarily findable by a search. And I can't read an electronic rulebook. And on the other hand, I don't like the idea of printing out a bunch of loose papers and stapling them together or whatever. I paid for the game. I expect the rule book to work. And that's very disappointing for me. I mean, even in the Grand Karen EU, where there's plenty of errata and plenty of things that I had questions about, and other AWE games where I had to pencil things in that I made decisions in. I don't have that opportunity in this rulebook because of the choice to make it a glossy rulebook. Obviously, if I printed my own rulebook, I could print it on regular paper, and then I could make notes in the margins as to my changes. The main thing that I feel like is that there's something close to this game, but with a different overarching idea that I would really, really like. And I do want to play around with it a little bit more before I make sort of a final determination on it. But this is my review. I may come back and have other words. I rated this really poorly because it was such a slipshod, crappy effort out of the box. I had expectations of bad rules from Thibault. This takes the cake. It really does. And it feels like, at least to me, decisions are being made that violate what the initial principle of the game was. And I bring up one example, but I've seen 3 or 4 different places through my playthrough where I'm like, wow, it really feels like there was an intention for something, and the decision was made because development didn't happen apparently, in the post-release shitstorm, to just throw a patch on that would make some people happier. And I think they got Thibault's okay and seal of approval. But to be honest, he offered no support for his other games, so I'm not really counting on his support on this to be anything. Le Grand Guerre, it was his co-designer who sat up and answered the questions and worked out the problems. And even then, that game has still got a few fundamental flaws that need to be corrected in it. EU, someone completely different rewrote all the event charts. Nobody can tackle the victory point system. They're just like, yeah. And I don't think that the Risto events actually help Russia enough. Russia is still unable to achieve anything like historical capacity in that. So, I mean, any game that you pick up of his, I think you just have to admit it's going to be a broken mess. The only question is, how bad is it? And this one's pretty fucking bad. But there might be hope. All right.